Okay.
So,
All right. So welcome to another episode of Going South. I'm really fortunate today and excited to talk to Dr. Tameka Bradley Hobbs. She is from Live Oak, Florida. She's a graduate of Florida A&M, where she got her BA in history. She got her PhD in United States history, historical administration, and public history from FSU. Currently, she is the Associate Provost for Academic Affairs and the founding director of the FMU Social Justice Institute at Florida Memorial University down in South Florida. She also serves on the board of directors for the South Florida People of Color, a nonprofit based down in Miami Shores, Florida, dedicated to eradicating racism through education and advocacy. Some of the same, sounds like similar work that the Institute does as well. She is also the author of Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, Racial Violence in Florida. I was really excited to get to talk with her, basically because we're kind of neighbors. She's from Live Oak, which is about an hour from here. The woman in my life drives to Live Oak once a week, and I often go with her. So I ride around your part of the woods down there. And she was gracious enough to talk with me about a pretty heavy topic. As many of you know, I'm the coordinator of the Mary Turner Project, and Dr. Hobbs has done an enormous amount of research on racial violence in North Florida. And again, it's a history that I didn't know about until I started reading her book in terms of specific incidences and specific individuals that were affected by kind of that violence. So first and foremost, thank you, Tameka, for making time today to talk with me. I know it's the end of your day and you've had a busy one, so I really do appreciate it. Can you just talk a little bit about what motivated you to put this book together, given the kind of weight of the topic? And as a person from North Florida, where most of what you wrote about occurred?
sure. It's a combination of a couple of things, and we can start with geography since you brought that up. I definitely wanted to contribute to what we understand about the Black experience in rural areas like the one that I'm from. I was raised in Live Oak, Florida, and spent 13 years being educated in Tallahassee. So been in that region for quite some time. And you know, even as I was dedicating my studies to the Black experience, what you do realize is that that landscape is quite uneven, that the metropolises around the region get more attention than Florida. When you come to Florida, it's Jacksonville, Miami, maybe Pensacola, maybe Tallahassee, but not much else is written about outside of that. And so for one, I'm really proud to be able to put onto a shelf, hopefully for a long time, this history of the region of the state that I'm from. But beyond that, the seeds for this book were really planted in me during my time as a student at Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, which you mentioned. And Florida A&M is an historically Black university. And as a part of that curriculum, as for many historically Black colleges, you are required to take an African American history course. And I did so my freshman year and was absolutely riveted. I was enthralled and excited and energized and inspired by the stories that I was learning. It helped to fill in so many gaps in my understanding and just my cursory reading of the landscape that I grew up with. Of course, by the time I came along, the worst vestiges of segregation were over, but the remnants were still very much on the landscape. When I looked at the west side of Live Oak, where my grandparents lived, versus some of the other areas where white people lived, the fact that they had sidewalks, the fact that they had amenities, the fact that they had access to sewer, while my grandfather and grandmother had a septic tank. So, you know, you see these things as a child, the quality of the architecture, so on and so forth. And no one really stops to fill in those gaps to tell you how the landscape around you came to be the way it was. But I found that at Florida A&M. And I continued to take classes. I eventually changed my major from business to history.
Wow.
And it was another one of those courses where I learned about the lynching that had taken place in my hometown. And that was the first time that I learned about the lynching of Willie James Howard. I was completely shocked. and horrified, right? These learning about lynching violence. And like many people, even today, this is not something that's common knowledge. It's not generally taught in, kind of those cursory courses that one would take in middle and high school. So I can remember one of my next trips home asking my grandfather about what I had learned in college, and we probably for the first time in our connection had a real conversation about race and racism. And my grandfather would have been a young boy back in 1944 when Willie James Howard was lynched, and I could see him, in his mind traveling back through those decades as we talked. And this was a man who, was very much in charge of our family. He was a religious leader in the community, but I could see the trepidation and the darkness fall over him as he kind of recounted what it was like for him to grow up as a young Black boy. The story of Willie James Howard was really a cautionary tale for him and so many other young African American boys, not only in Live Oak in the region, about what could happen to you. And little did I know that that conversation and some of the subsequent conversations that I would have with elders in my community of Live Oak over the years, my professor, Dr. Theodore Hemingway, was interested in the topic and asked me to do a little sleuthing for him. I didn't even realize that there was a technical name for what I was doing, oral history. And that really was the beginning of all of this. If you fast forward a couple of years, by the time I decided to go to graduate school and I'm thinking about what I want to research, I decided, that I wanted to write about not only the lynching of Willie James Howard, but these other lynchings that had been documented in that region during the same period of time. And that was really the genesis of my doctoral dissertation that ultimately became a book, Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home.
Yeah. Was your grandfather open to that conversation immediately, or was there any hesitation when you approached him about Willie James Howard?
It's been many years now. This would have been back in the early 90s. My grandfather passed away, I think in 2000, 2002. But from what I can remember, it was, I think he was so surprised that I knew about it, that he hadn't thought about it in a long time, that once he got over, I guess, being taken back to that difficult place, he was willing to share a little bit. We did not have a long conversation, I will tell you that, but it stays with me. I can see his face. I can see because it was such a shift. Again, this is, the man that was the rock of my family. He was fearless. He was, he was our Superman. But to see him, I describe it in my book as shrink a little bit and recognizing that. And he was a very complex man. I didn't understand him, but again, through my studies of history, I do recognize that some of the worst aspects of his personality, I suspect, were born of these jilted and unfulfilled dreams. He was incredibly ambitious. He was very bright. My grandparents, he finished the fourth grade before he went back and got some additional schooling as an adult. My grandmother finished in the eighth grade, but their middle class sensibilities and aspirations. I mean, they had a parlor. My grandmother loved to decorate. They had a small library. They had a piano. I look back at it now and recognize, how aspirational this was for them, that they were really crafting a life for themselves beyond what had been prescribed from them. My grandfather, later in his life had accumulated a number of properties. He was a very proud property owner, but he also worked for a number of years at Occidental, the mining company there. And I do remember him on various occasions expressing anger at his inability to be promoted, that he was training younger white men who were much less experienced than him, who would go on to become his supervisors. And sometimes that manifested as a domineering nature at home, but I think it was just this unfulfilled, desires that were, a part of his society. And this story of Willie James Howard and what that was like for him is just one aspect of of that framing. So
Do you mind talking just a little bit about that particular case? Because he was, what, 15 when he was killed? And I'm
yes.
assuming your grandfather and he, like you said, were contemporaries
Hmm.
to
They
some
would have
of
been
them.
around in there. He would have been a younger boy during that time. But yeah, to talk about Willie James Howard, Willie James Howard, by all accounts of the people that I talked to two women who had been in my life for years. One lived right across the street from my church. She me and her granddaughter went to schools for years. Another woman taught me science. They both were classmates of Willie James Howard. Another woman who I grew up with in my home church, Sweet Hope Baptist Church, was his cousin. But I was able to interview all of them, and they told a pretty consistent story about him, that he was well liked, that he, was fair complected, perhaps a little chubby, but jovial. He was a jovial young man. As a matter of fact, his nickname was Giddy Boy, giddy like happy. The other thing that they told me is that he was always singing. He had a wonderful singing voice and loved to share, loved to entertain. And that is where the central controversy about his murder comes to bear. He had been hired in the winter of 1943 to work in the downtown Five and Dime store, and as I understand it, it was a bit of a boon. Not many young Black kids were hired in that way, but he got an opportunity to work indoors instead of in the tobacco fields or the watermelon fields, sweeping the floor. And it was at that position that he came in contact with another teenager. Her name was Cynthia Goff. Apparently, Cynthia Goff was also working at that store. She was a local high school student, but she happened to be the daughter of a pretty influential gentleman by the name of Philip Goff. Philip Goff had been elected to represent the region in the Florida legislature. He was at that time serving as the postmaster. And so this is a family of some standing. But what allegedly happened, and I'll separate the stories here. What is left in the written record, and these come from the NAACP records, correspondence that was sent to the governor, to the federal level. What remains there is this storyline that Willie James Howard had written a love note to Cynthia Goff. And the only thing that remains of that letter is a transcript, not the original handwritten letter. And that for me is very suspicious. The letter talks about, his feelings for her, that he's sorry if he had offended her with a card. Apparently, this was a Christmas card that had been written and given around the holiday time, and he signed it with love. And as the story goes, she was offended. This was his way of apologizing, but he goes on to say that I wish that we were in a northern state, and then, things would be different for you. I love your face. I love your voice. For a sweetheart, you are my choice. Not sweetheart spelled out, but SH. This is what is represented in the note. And it's that document allegedly that her father found. Her father goes out and enlists some compatriots, two other white men in the community, who go and kidnap Willie James Howard at gunpoint from his mother. Then go and kidnap his father, who was working at a lumber mill near the railroad tracks in Live Oak. They could also kidnap him at gunpoint. The party of five then drives out to the bank of the Swanee River, where Willie James Howard is bound. And we have one singular version of the story that says the white men in this case are going to later claim that they only wanted to have Willie James Howard punish his son for this violation of the racial etiquette. But that Willie James became hysterical, he refused to be punished, and that he jumped into the depths of the Swanee River at his own volition, and blamed his father for not intervening to save his life, ironically. Yeah. The other part of this that is also quite tragic, and this is, we can have another conversation about this, is that James Howard, the father, was forced to co-sign an affidavit that agreed to the version of events that Philip Goff and these men laid claim to, this version of the story that I'm telling you now. Let me back that up, and let's go back to the controversy over the note. While the written record claims that this was a love note, what I found in my oral history, and I actually interviewed a woman who was well into her 90s, who claimed to have witnessed this happening. What they claim happened was that Willie James Howard had actually, at the request of Cynthia Goff, written down the lyrics to a love song that he had been singing that day. And one of the women that I interviewed went as far as to call the name of the song. I have been unable to corroborate it based on the name that she gave me. But she said the song was, "If this isn't love, it'll have to do until then." This woman, the 90-year-old woman who I talked to this is more recently, probably in the last 10 years when I was preparing the manuscript, in speaking to her, she claimed that she'd been in the store and overheard Cynthia making that request of Willie James. Mm. But what has persistently existed within the African-American community and the oral legacy is that Willie James Howard had only written down these lyrics to a song, and that is what Phil Goff found, and that is what precipitated his murder. And there's a chasm that exists between these two stories. Yeah. Because for a young Black boy in that period of time, you had to have known what would have been at stake for you to do something like writing a love note to a white girl. But in my mind, it fits a certain narrative. It fits a narrative that in the minds of the white community would have justified Willie James Howard's murder. And that's why I think it exists. Conversely, in the story that exists in the African-American community, it is one that confirms Willie James Howard's status as a victim, that he was unwitting, that he was innocent, that he was victimized in this white, swirl of white racist violence, and that ultimately cost him his life. And so I find that to be vastly interesting. And what I've tried to do, not only in that instance, but the other 4 that I write about, where I was able to retrieve oral history from community members, is to just allow those different interpretations to coexist. And it's really important because you have to recognize that, history is composed of the records that are left behind. And for so long, whether we're talking about during the period of enslavement, when African Americans were unable by law, to be taught how to read and write, to even the period that we're dealing with now that impacted even members of my own family, the economic demands on you and the need to work prevented you the leisure time and the resources to be able to leave a lot of the written records that historians like you and I rely on to tell these stories. And so the only corrective that we are left is oral history. And one of the things I'm most proud about is being able to bring in those voices, bring in those perspectives into the record, and to provide something that is a little closer to the truth about what happens in these instances. I'll share with you one last story. I wanted to talk about what happened on the banks of the Swanee River. You heard me reference the affidavit that James Howard was forced to sign. Well, James Howard was married to Lula Howard. Lula Howard was a classmate of Harry T. Moore. And I know many of your listeners are probably in Georgia, but for us in the state of Florida, Harry T. Moore is one of the quintessential civil rights leader in our history. He was a native of Swanee County. It's where he would have met Lula Howard. He's actually a graduate of Florida Memorial College, the college I now teach for, that is in South Florida. It has a very interesting history in and of itself, but during that period, it had a campus in Live Oak. Harry T. Moore was the valedictorian of the class of 1925. And has a long record as a civil rights advocate. He's the first president of the Florida Conference of the NAACP. He worked after 1944 in the US Supreme Court case of Smith versus Allwright that struck down the all-white primaries. Between that time and his assassination in 1951, he worked and registered something like 110,000 African-American voters in the state of Florida, which was incredibly impressive. I could sing his praises all day. But it was Harry T. Moore who came to the aid of the Howard family. He helped them to leave Live Oak, sell their property, resettle and shelter in Orlando, Florida. And it was during that time that he connected with James Howard and had recorded a new affidavit, James Howard, in his own words, talking about what he'd witnessed that January day in 1944, in the moments before his son drowned to death in the Swanee River. And it is a document that I found at the National Archives in College Park. And I can remember the day that I was in the reading room going over this affidavit. It took everything in me not to cry in grief at what I was reading. When you read the words of a man recounting the last moments of his only son's life, his only child, discussing how his hands were bound, describing the gun that was trained on his son, recounting his last words to his son, that his son gave him his watch and his wallet, that he said to his son that he wasn't worried because he prayed for him. And watching these white men tell his son that he could either take what was in the gun or he could jump into the river, and watching Willie James dive over the edge into the chilling waters of that river. Absolutely horrific to read about, to imagine, but so important for us to know, to acknowledge. And the only justice we have is the ability to be able to call the names of the murderers who were involved in that situation.
Can I ask about that narrative, the love letter? Because there's a similar story, and I get that was the narrative about protecting white womanhood, right? Do you think that that narrative was used against adolescent boys? You know what I mean? Instead of, because there's a case with Jesse Slater in Brooks County who's accused of writing a white girl love letter. I think he was 14 or 15. There's a case in Jasper, Florida, same story, right? And I'm just wondering if there are patterns like that around that narrative.
Oh, are there patterns? The one that you're describing is the pattern. The major justification that was articulated when Southerners were called to account for this type of violence that flew in the face of everything that we claim to be as a country. We're supposed to be a nation of laws. If there is an accusation of a crime, we have a judicial process, a legal process that's supposed to kick into place. Investigation, indictment, trial, defense, confronting witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. Due process. All of that flies out of the window in these cases. And so when Southern leaders were asked, why do you persist in something that is a violation of the law? And the defense that they most often gave it was that we have to protect our white women. That if we don't lynch Black men, they are such beasts, they are such animals, they are so lascivious that they would run rampant over the region. Now, of course, all of this is born of this pornographic fiction that is very much a part of Southern culture, but it sticks. It sticks. And it was, back with Ida B. Wells, little woman out of Rust. She was a graduate of Rust College, Mississippi. She's from Holly Springs, Mississippi, ends up in Memphis, Tennessee. And as a result of her friends being killed under false pretense, that she begins her career as an investigative journalist, going in and researching the allegations and around instances of lynching. And what she found is that in less than 25% of the cases was there ever an actual rape or an attempted rape. So she blew the lid off of this in the 1890s with the publication of her book, Southern Horrors. But you have to understand that is something that has been incredibly persistent. The other thing that's important, and for me, this is one of those subjects. I think there's a lot of Black history that is this way. You can't just talk about the past, because so many of the root issues of the past still echo and are with us very much today. There is a sociologist by the name of Philip Ativo Golf. He regularly commentates now, I think, on some of the news channels. But he published an article a few years ago called "The Essence of Innocence." I think the name of it was. But in that study, what he was able to document, he and his research partners, that African American boys and to an extent Latinx boys were routinely seen as older and more culpable for their actions by members of the general public. For their study, they used a group of college students, but they also tested their theory with law enforcement officers and with people who would serve on juries, and their results were consistent. And so that's something that is a finding in the 21st century, but I think it also echo back to the period that we're talking about, and raises a very important point. And even going back to my grandfather, going back to other men who I interviewed, they knew as young boys, they were groomed, they were reared to understand the particularly precarious position that they were in. That is one of the things that I do remember my grandfather saying to me, that if he was on a street and encountered a white woman coming his way, that he would turn around and go home. No matter what he was doing, he would not cross paths with that white woman, because he knew all it took would be some misconstrued gesture, and that would cost him his life. I had another man, Sam Beasley, who's passed away now, who told me something similar, that when the public pool opened in Live Oak, that Black boys were instructed not to even walk down the street, because the accusation that if they looked over at those white girls in their bathing suits at the public pool, that would be enough. They could be the next Willie James Howard. And he said, relay that to me just like that, that Willie James Howard and the ghost of Willie James Howard haunted them in that community for years to come.
I've never thought about the love letter trope or narrative, specifically to target adolescent boys, right? Still around kind of, protecting white female purity. And one of the cases we want to dig into more is the case of Jesse Slater over in Brooks County. So your book focuses on 4 folks that are kind of within a stone's throw. I was thinking, I've spent a lot of time in Madison, particularly with white liberals, white older liberal Democratic women. And it was interesting. I was doing some volunteer work down there for years, and they could talk about everything except race. And most were in their 60s to late 70s, but they're from Madison.
My father is from Madison.
Really. And so it's the other thing I appreciated about your book is that it was close to home. And again, these stories that I had never heard. The other thing I learned a whole lot from is your kind of analysis of the decline in lynching, right, and the forces that kind of went into that. And you talked about how kind of lynching goes underground to some degree, right, that it becomes more rural. It's more kind of, instead of a public spectacle, it transitions into something more private, I guess would be the word. I mean, could you say a little bit about that transition and why that happened?
Yeah, that term private mob I take from Fitzhugh Brundage, who did a pretty extensive study on lynching in Georgia and Virginia. And he gives us this framework to kind of understand lynching violence and the way that it was perpetrated. And you go from kind of the spectacle lynchings where, there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of people who come out and participate, to what he describes as private mobs. And all of the instances, of the 4 instances that I write about, would fall into that category. Taking place between 1941 and 1945 as private mobs, small groups operating, coordinating secretly in order to achieve the same means. And so that's really important. The incident for me that best illustrates this is the 2 chapters in which I write about what happened in Marianna, Florida, Jackson County, with Celis Harrison. And Jackson County is really important because it was the site of what is considered one of the last spectacle lynchings to take place in the United States. I'm speaking, of course, of the brutal lynching of Claude Neal in 1934. Claude Neal had been accused of the murder of Lola Kennedy, a young white girl. Again, in the African-American community, it seemed to be open knowledge that they were carrying on a consensual relationship. But when she turns up dead, Claude Neal becomes the target of violence. And it's a pretty incredible story. While the law enforcement officers did, in this case, did their due diligence in trying to protect Claude Neal's life, they spirited him from Marianna over to Pensacola. When that proved not to be safe, they took him up to Brewster, Alabama. But the mob pursued them there, was able to intercept them, took Claude Neal from the law enforcement officers that were attempting to protect him, and brought him back to the Kennedy farm for the purposes of lynching him. But what was really interesting about this is that there was public acknowledgement that it went out over the airwaves, over the radio, what they were planning to do, that there were trains that were redirected to bring people down to Jackson County to participate in this. So we end up in a situation where allegedly there were thousands of people who descended on Marianna in order to witness and participate in what happened to Claude Neal. And it was an absolutely grotesque, ritualized maiming and torture of him before he was actually killed. All of those people, because it was such a small group, apparently, that was responsible for killing him. And they could not participate in the bloodlust of seeing him expire. They then turn their attentions to the Black community. And it just becomes this really terrible episode in Florida's history. It was a black eye for the state. Fast forward to 1940, 1943. What happens in this case in 1941 is that there's a murder of a white gas station attendant by the name of Johnny Mayo. And they're having trouble closing the case. It becomes the subject, focal point of the next election. The sheriff that's running says, if you elect me, I will find the person who murdered Johnny Mayo. And then shortly after he's in office, he gets a lead, and that believes him leads him to identify Celis Harrison as the person who committed this murder. What is interesting is that there is this overlap between what happens with the previous lynching in the state that would have been of Arthur Williams in Gadsden County, Quincy, in 1941, that in attempting to get Celis Harrison to confess, they spirit him out of Marianna and they take him to Quincy for alleged safekeeping. But everyone in that region would have known that Arthur Williams had been kidnapped and lynched from that same facility the week before. They take him there temporarily. They put him back on the road. They're headed towards Tallahassee. The law enforcement officers that are accompanying Celis Harrison say, hey, you just tell us that you did it. If you just confess, these guys that are chasing you, again, this imaginary lynch mob that they're trying to convince Harrison is behind them, will leave you alone. And so when he gets to Tallahassee, Celis Harrison is going to sign this confession. Now, that was supposed to be the end of that. And my theory is that the folks in Marianna, because of the lessons of 1934, didn't want to have this ugly incident. They wanted to instead have what we would call today a legal lynching, where they put their fingers on the scale of justice, where they forced a confession, which would have, been a bow on the top of the box of his conviction, and just send him off perhaps to the electric chair. That's what was happening. And it probably would have been achieved if not for the intervention of a white attorney, Benjamin Franklin Barnes. I've had the privilege of meeting his daughter, staying with her, learning about him from her. She affectionately describes him as the Atticus Finch of Marianna, but he gave a vigorous defense of his client. He combated and fought against this forced confession, making it to the Florida Supreme Court twice. And on the second time, the Florida Supreme Court agreed with the defense team for Celis Harrison. And what's interesting, and this is kind of the second part, the story is so juicy, and I split it over 2 chapters, is that at the point that the white citizens of Mariana realize that their attempts at illegal lynching will not be achieved, they go back to the old way, and they end up kidnapping Celis Harrison from jail. I did not find out until I went back for another round of oral histories what people remembered about that incident. I had a couple people tell me they vividly remember hearing Celis Harrison yelling for his life. The men that were going to kill him, this small private mob, drove him intentionally through the Black neighborhood and had him yell out. So they heard him pleading for his life. And that's something that, kind of brings up another very important element that I don't think we talk enough about, and that is the terroristic element of lynching, that it was not necessarily only about killing this one person, this alleged perpetrator of crimes real or imagined, but to send a message to Black people in their entirety, the entire community, that you stay in your place or else. If you get out of place, this will happen to you. And we will be able to walk around and go to church and go to school and run our businesses. No one will ever bat an eye if we kill you. And that's a credibly impactful piece, which is also when we look at the totality of the lynching violence in Florida, while we are, somehow considered to be less Southern, population is smaller. When we think about racial violence, we think about states like Mississippi and Alabama first. When you break this down per capita, Florida is the deadliest state for a Black person to live in the United States of America. Florida had the highest rate of lynching of any state in the country per capita. And when you imagine what it's like to live under the threat of that type of violence, terroristic violence, you begin to understand what Jim Crow was like. It was a multifaceted system that was perpetrated through legislation, that was enforced by law enforcement, that resulted in economic oppression. But at the pinnacle of that was lynching violence, the threat of death, the threat of murder if you don't fall in line. And I think it's really important for us to understand all of those contributing factors to that phenomenon.
Yeah, I didn't know until I started reading your book that Florida outranked Mississippi, which in terms of per capita violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is up with North Florida? Like, I've lived in North Carolina. I've lived in a lot of different places doing racial justice work, but if I'm honest with you, nothing scares me pretty much like North Carolina and North Florida. And even today with kind of neo-Confederate activity, there is something different about, and it's not just that it's rural, because you know what I mean? You talked about a lot of different structural factors, the New Deal and things that have occurred that have really changed Florida in some ways, but am I just paranoid that North Florida still is kind of, I don't know, locked in time or something?
You know what? I couldn't begin to fathom about what's going on there now, but I do share your assessment, and I think all the way over to Jacksonville, through, and it's that borderlands, right, between Southern Georgia, North Florida. If you take that all the way out, it is, it's the lack of progressiveness, I guess, is what I'll say about it. But I will say historically, what I look at in these same counties that I write about is the agricultural basis of the economy. And again, I talked just a moment ago about the economic angle to this. So much of this was motivated around what I like to term the commodification of Black people, right? And this is a continuing theme. And some people follow that theme from slavery, when Black bodies were outright commodities, right, to this period of transition with emancipation. But then there are all of these strictures that come back into place that, are able to achieve a certain level of commodification of Black bodies. And sometimes that look like convict leasing. Sometimes it looked like sharecropping. But the desire to have a robust supply of cheap Black labor is a motivating factor for a lot of things. And I think if we follow that trend, there's a lot to be said there. But for me, in response to your question, I really think it's economic. One of the places where I see it most starkly, to be honest with you, is in Gadsden County. The shade tobacco economy that existed there was highly profitable. They're one of the only places outside of Cuba that could grow the tobacco leaves that could be used as wrappers for cigars. It took a lot of technological interventions to run the shade, to cure the tobacco in a certain way, but it was big business for them. For many years, coming out of the antebellum period, even late into the 20th century. They were so committed to the tobacco agriculture at the expense of Black people in Gadsden County that well into the 60s and 70s, Black students had a shorter school year. They let them out of school early so that they could go and work in the tobacco fields. White kids were in school learning, but Black kids were out farming. And it just goes to show, that has always blown my mind, but because it's something that just represents such a commitment on all parties in this community to the economic exploitation of not just Black people generally, but Black children.
Yeah. Well, and I think that commodification can be seen too with mass incarceration across that same region you're describing. We spent a couple of years going down to Olustee to film at the battle down there. You had Natural Bridge over in Tallahassee, but there's 4 prisons that literally surround the Olustee battlefield. One of them's a private one, and it's just another kind of one of those manifestations.
Yeah, I have a friend who's interested in telling that story, and it saddens me at a lot of levels, the way that commodification now has manifested, because especially with this move to privatization of prisons, the contracts that exist between these corporations and state governments, and these prisons often operate like hotels. They want maximum occupancy. And one of the last, controversies that I heard a few years ago was that these contracts were being renegotiated, and that if they were not able to achieve a 90%, occupancy, that there would be, compensation from the state. But when you have to ask the deeper question, who are you planning to put in these jails? If this is your financial model, you are financially betting on a certain segment of this population to fail. And we know historically that has been Black people. The other portion of this is that when you have in these small communities, like the one I have come from, I talked about the mining company that my grandfather worked for. It was a Tri-County employer. That's now gone away. Chicken processing and Gold Kiss for many years. So many of my relatives worked there, earned their living, fed their families working there. That's gone away. One of the only industries that is left is corrections, and there are way too many Black people involved in that economy. Even at our colleges, for many HBCUs, the most popular major is criminal justice. And it's born of people who've had some negative experience with law enforcement, criminal justice, prisons, what have you, and they want to be a part of the change. But I've argued and been a part of trying to design curriculum, and even with the Social Justice Institute, infuse this lens of racial justice in our students so that they don't go into those systems and structures and continue to perpetuate those systems. And yeah, there's a reckoning that needs to come, but it's tough because it's a bread and butter issue.
Yeah, when a lot of these small southern towns are competing to have those prisons just for a source of employment. I think it's a tragic commentary on our society,
absolutely,
on multiple levels, that I think is connected to to your work, and it goes back to the inception of the country. The other thing I was thinking, I wanted to ask you, and I don't know about the Florida data, but because you talked about legal lynching a minute ago, when I looked at the Georgia capital punishment data, it looked to me that capital punishment becomes the state sanctioned lynching in many
Absolutely.
ways. Is that the same case in Florida, where you have all white juries convicting folks
I
without
think
really
it's
due
a
process, you know?
Yeah, it's the case in much of the South. I can't remember the author of the study. I think it would have been published in the late '90s, but I quoted in my book that shows this relationship between the decline of lynching and the rise of capital punishment in the South. That's no accident. I think we simply swapped one phenomenon for another. One of the next projects that I'm working on is telling the story of the Quincy Five, going back to Gaston County. This time, instead of writing about the 1940s, the 1970s, and when there is the murder and robbery of a deputy sheriff in Tallahassee, that these wheels of justice, or injustice, really kick into motion. And it's a really important moment in American history, right? We've had the civil rights movement, 1964, 1965, major legislation coming down. You have the assassination of King in '68. But there is this rise of Black elected officials, both in the state and throughout the region. So we're in this transitional period. But what you will find, and is testified to in what we see with the Quincy Five, is that you still have a good old boy system operating within law enforcement, and they were determined to make sure that somebody paid for the murder of deputy rebels, and that ends up being 5 young men who didn't commit the crime, who are going to be sent, who are going to be put on trial. One of them, Dave Keaton, is sentenced to death row. He subsequently becomes the first person in the modern era to be a death row exoneree when he eventually is freed once the truth of the situation is found out. All of these men are not charged, but their lives are touched in such a way that they are never the same. Their families are never the same. And I'm working with the attorney who defended these men, Kent Spriggs, civil rights attorney out of Tallahassee, and helping to tell the stories. There's only one of the Quincy Five who now is still living, Mr. Johnny Burns, who still lives in Quincy. But there is a just incredibly powerful story to be told about the injustices that they experienced. It just is heartbreaking to think about. But for me, it is kind of the next stopping point in this chronology around what's happening or not happening with our criminal justice system in the state of Florida.
Yeah. This may be too personal, so please, how do you manage all this information? Because I move through the world feeling like I'm a Southern white man, feeling like the South is haunted. The South is, and time is not pieces cut up, that there's kind of a trajectory that goes all the way back to whether it's the stealing of Creek people or the land from the Creek people in Lowndes County, to the fact that when our community here was created in 1860, half the people were enslaved. That, and like you alluded to earlier, we have emancipation, but then we have neo-slavery, right? Debt peonage, we have lynching, we have Jim Crow. And the schools in my community weren't desegregated until I was in the 3rd grade.
It wasn't until the '70s for my parents. My brother and I are the first generation in our family never to have attended segregated schools. So there's been this really long legacy.
Yeah, to me, it's all connected, which goes back to something we talked about before we started recording. And as a boy, I remember Black elders not looking me in the eye. I remember being called Mr. Mark by grown men in their 60s who were African American as a boy. So that thing was still very much alive, right? And so we have, at the same time, we have this kind of submerged history. And I don't pretend to know what needs to happen, but I think it's a question of both trauma, right? And how does one what does healing look like, whether it's on the
Mm.
micro level in these communities? So I ask all that to say, because when we started talking, I kind of gave you an out today because it's such a heavy topic, and I think it can be traumatizing in its own way. And I appreciate you sharing your work and, stepping out on this limb with me today when I'm sure there's a zillion other things that you could be doing. But what's it been like for you to like do these interviews? Like, how do you carry this stuff with you? What do you think we need to be doing as communities, as a nation? I know there's a whole lot in there, but
Yeah, so that's a juicy one. I will tell you, I guess it comes in phases. When I was a graduate student, when I was working on the manuscripts, when I'm doing the work, I am just really focused on gathering the information, getting the story right, the validation, crafting, the writing to make sure it's right. I loved collecting oral history. I haven't been active in quite some time. There's such a feeling of rescue. There's a West African saying, proverb that says that when an elder dies, it's like a library burning.
hmm,
I very much see that. And so for me, every interview, every recording, every session, and many of the people that I've talked about and talked to have passed away. I feel that I've done some small work in helping to reclaim and preserve their stories. And so, I feel proud about that. I'm really glad to do that work. It is also, I think the harder part for me has come when there is this continuation. I came to Florida Memorial, which is in Miami Gardens, Florida, Miami-Dade County, in for the 2011-2012 academic year. In the spring of that year, Trayvon Martin was murdered. I was working on my book manuscript.
wow.
I have two sons, Black boys that I'm raising. I'm working on a campus full of Black men and Black women. I also read that year Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which completely upended everything that I thought I understood with our conversation about private prisons and these systems that, make sure that a certain segment of the population is going to end up in prison. And it was a pivot for me. I part of the reason when I talk about me being a historian and I worked in a museum on campus, my entree into the field of history came through public history because I wanted more people to have the experience that I had when I was a freshman at FAM. I wanted people to know this stuff. And not everybody's going to read the book, but there are many more people who would go to the museum. So that was supposed to be the thing that I would do. And I've always found myself kind of trying to bridge these things. And that was also true back in 2012. How could I continue to work with what I knew as a historian, what I understood as an academician at a university to help address some of the real problems that existed. And it's out of that energy that I connected with Sabrina Fulton, who's a graduate of Florida Memorial. I was able to negotiate her foundation, the Trayvon Martin Foundation, coming to our campus. But it was in those years, those intervening years, and working with her, the last 4 or 5 years, that the idea for a social justice institute at our university was born. And I've kind of carried that around. I left there, came to Valdosta for a
Yeah,
minute.
yeah,
I was
yeah.
head of African American Studies there for the 2018, 2019 academic year. And it was when I came back with this new administration and was sharing this concept, and I got a positive response. But then last year happened, and as we were searching for what would be our response, we decided that the Social Justice Institute would be that thing that we could do to help be a part of the change. And so the long range vision is to create a research institute that can address the issues. For me, where I started was what went wrong with Trayvon and what can we do to make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone else again. There's a lot more that we know that needs to be addressed now, and we want to tackle that. But more than anything, in the lower hanging fruit is as we work to really secure the investments to make the vision for the institute come to fruition, is the consciousness raising, and that's something that I, as an educator, as a historian, I know is work that needs to be done. Very important work, because so much of all of this, the laws, our society rests on what we understand and our motivation on what to do. And there's never been a movement in this country to the benefit of Black people that has not been interracial. And that's from abolition to the civil rights movement. Some people even argue today that we're on the cusp of a third Reconstruction, where we need allyship to really kind of burst through the last vestiges of in unequal opportunity in this country. And so, you know, I try to stay focused there. Where the work gets hard, I mean, when you were talking in the first part of framing your question, I kept thinking about the phrase, "I see dead people." Because there is a haunting that takes place. I live in South Florida now, and when I drive from here to go see my parents in Live Oak, I see these signs. I see signs from Groveland, but Groveland has a certain meaning because of the Groveland Four and the injustice against those four African-American youths. The advocacy in that case of Harry T. Moore that puts him square in the sights of the Ku Klux Klan and leads to his assassination. I see signs for Ocoee. Last November, we recognized the 100th anniversary of the massacre that took place there in November of 1920, when African-American people decided to vote. And a city that had a population of 500 Black people had a population of 0 for the next several decades because of that instance of racial violence. You go up and, you know, there are markers that take you through Levy County, which is Rosewood, which 3 years later, 1923. So, I mean, it's inescapable. It's across the landscape. I will say perhaps the most difficult time I've had was at Montgomery, Alabama, when I had a chance to visit Brian Stevenson's The Equal Justice Initiative's museum. The museum was okay, but it really was the National Memorial for Peace and Justice that I found to be incredibly moving. And it was, you know, it really, for me, I struggled with the reaction, the emotional reaction I was having. I wasn't used to it. And it's like, how can you write about this stuff and then come to this place and just be on the verge of tears? And when I thought about it, what I realized is that the way that they have constructed this space, really and truly as a memorial that's beautiful, that invites inspection and reflection, and then the way that they have installed those pillars that mimics hanging bodies. I think those individual structures in and of themselves are beautiful, but when you look at them in their totality, walking through that memorial, you are absolutely overcome and overwhelmed by the scope and scale of this violence and how it was able to go on for so long. And you look at the names, the thousands of names that are listed there, and understand that each of them represents a dead person, a person who was murdered. And it is absolutely jarring and horrifying to walk through and be confronted with the reality of it. And it does exactly what it was designed to do and what we need it to do. Because until we confront that horrible legacy that happened right here, we know so much about all of the other travesties that have happened in all these other parts of the world without contending with the real struggle that is played out here in our country, that affected my people, that was perpetrated, you know, right here. And so to go to the later part of your question, I was in a conversation earlier today and they asked me about reconciliation. There can be no reconciliation until there is truth. Amen. And a full accounting and a full acknowledgement of the extent, not just, and again, not just of the names, the thousands of names, but all of the families that love those names and those people, all of the things that were lost, all of the lands that were, that were lost when people fled the South and went north and left behind their blood, sweat, and tears and what they had poured into this land and this region, when they lost a business, when they lost hope. We have to tell that story and have people own that story and acknowledge that story. For far too long, Black people have been marginalized and we've had to hold this bag on our own. And it's high time that there is a better accounting, and some honesty and some truth and some apology. Then we can get to the healing part. But it's a really difficult road. And I don't know that we have the stomach for it. We've seen successful efforts in South Africa and Germany, but we are so, committed to the fake news of American exceptionalism, to the fake news of the lost cause, that our disposition, just especially in the South, right? You made it regional. Let's take it back to the region. The way that we have been allowed the lie of the Confederacy to dominate the historical narrative of the South as well as its landscape, is an instructive lesson of how difficult it's going to be for us to right these wrongs. So,
I lived in Portland, Oregon for 4 years and taught there. There was a whole different beast there. In fact, I came back to the South because I would rather deal with this beast than deal with that beast, in all honesty. But I think about this all the time in terms of the trauma that's been passed down generationally, right? Because one of the things you write kind of in the closing of your book was the consequences, these families that were left behind, right? Like these things traumatize generations, right? And at the same time, I think about white folks and where my family was, because my parents were alive during what you're talking about happened. I'm sure they knew about it. And we don't need to go into the macabre details of what happened at some of these lynchings, right? Like how, I still grapple with the question of how can humans behave in this way, to torture other folks, to treat folks worse than they would treat an animal that they owned, right? And that to me has never been addressed, acknowledged, or explored in terms of what the implications are. I thought about this a lot when they celebrated the 50th anniversary of the desegregation of the Arkansas schools. And, generally when that happens, they go and interview the pioneers, the folks that suffered, the humiliation and the verbal and physical violence to kind of break those barriers. But I'm still wanting to know where are the white folks that spit on those children, that threw eggs, where is the change of heart? Where is the confession, the apology? And like you said, we live in a place where we should be celebrating the fact that we lost the Civil War, not bemoaning it around some propaganda that was put out there decades after the fact. So I don't want to keep you too long, because again, I know you've had a long day. Do you think we're fixing to go through a third Reconstruction like Samuel Barber and other folks are saying? We certainly, it feels like Reconstruction again, right? This, given the last election and the mobilization and folks of color exercising their political power. How are you? I know that's kind of a weird segue, but I'm just wondering where you're at with that.
No, I will embrace it. I have written about it. I've spoken about it a little bit. I'm hoping for it. I think that if nothing else, last year allowed more people to see. It allowed people to see the thing that many of us since 2012 have been trying to confront and to raise. How is it that all of these Black people in the prime of their lives can continue to be snuffed out by state-sponsored forces, and there is no rallying cry, that there is no identification that there is something wrong or incomplete, that these justifications that are given by vigilantes or police officers are insufficient and unacceptable? That has been the genesis of the entire Black Lives Matter movement. I feel that last year they were finally heard. I think they were finally heard because we were quarantining. Daily life had slowed down and changed. I think many Americans had more bandwidth with which to absorb. And of course, I'm really referring to non-people of color, white folks. And I think that horrific video that we're now reliving now that Derek Chaffin is on trial. People had to deal with the horrificness, the horror that was. And I think that's what accounted for this, record-breaking number of protests that we saw in every state in our union and across the globe. The largest movement that we've seen in American history to date. The question becomes, what are we going to do about it? And there's a lot that's swirling there, because I think a lot of this has been fomented by the likes of Donald Trump, who I could see back when he was on the campaign trail in 2015 was incredibly dangerous for the state of race relations in this country. And my fears back then have only been realized in what we've seen since. We now have, since he's been disempowered, the legacy of the angst and the disinformation that he has fomented is still very much alive. It manifested in what we saw in Washington, D.C. on January the 6th, which was incredibly dangerous and something we all need to be paying attention to. It continues to live in the repressive, antiquated, throwback to the Jim Crow era voter disenfranchisement laws that we see being passed in Georgia, under consideration in Florida. So we have a choice, I think, for those of us who know better. Are we going to continue the promises that have been in some ways stalled out and unfulfilled in their full extent since the 1960s? Yes, we have laws, but racial disparities statistically in banking, in housing, in income, in employment, in the wealth gap very clearly point to stagnation on the part of the inclusion of Black people in the wealth that is this country. Are we okay with that? Or do we want something different? And if you want something different, what are you willing to do about it? I think those are the questions before us. And what I'm hoping for is that we can maintain the energy, the desire to learn and to know more that was really born last year in the aftermath of the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Brunswick, Georgia, same region that we're talking about, Breonna Taylor, and most famously now George Floyd. Is it enough to get us to sit and do the work that we've stalled and have not really done that, taken that deep dive? And it really is the genesis behind the Social Justice Institute that I'm leading, and hoping to be an engine for that conversation and for that work. So we'll see.
Well, it seems like a good place to stop. I, again, appreciate you having this conversation with me after you've had a long day. I appreciate your work. I'm excited to see what the Institute's doing, and just thank you for making time today, and thank you for the work you've already done. I learned so much from your book, and it raised a zillion other questions that I have. But
well, I thank you. I thank you for the opportunity, and I thank you for your work. It was amazing. I had been following the work, following the story, was really impressed. But I think, as I was coming to Valdosta, you had left Valdosta. Yeah. Now that I'm away from Valdosta, you're back in Valdosta. But there's this thing called Facebook. So I'm glad that we've been brought into each other's orbit and could connect. Thank you for being an ally. Thank you for being dedicated to telling these very difficult stories. There's not a whole lot of us out there. Not a lot of people want to look away, but I think you asked me how I do it. You know how I do it because you do it too. Yeah. So, but let's keep it going.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Tameka. I appreciate you.
You're welcome.